part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Chapter 23, The Gemini Man. Prologue. This episode of the Hyman Podcast is dedicated to Kate Mogan, Ben Buckwalter, Karen Valentine, the faculty and staff of Everett's Middle School, and the students that graced its halls from 2010 to 2014. My life is better having known you all. Thank you. As it goes, so often we find ourselves at a crossroad, one way or the other. And not too often do we know which way to go, and even more rarely do we have hints or intuition or gut feelings that we can rely on. We find ourselves on a path, and there are variables upon variables that guide you through to the next phase of life. We don't tend to question the decisions right then and there, we just live. And things happen. Things happen around us, things happen to us, and things happen because of us. And we encounter people, and sometimes they become fixtures in your life, and sometimes they are just there long enough for you to find your way to the next big thing. It's the nature of the cosmos. Life happens. And years later, when you look back at both the good and the bad, and at specific points, sometimes those crossroads, sometimes other places, you wonder to yourself, was it worth it? From the Hyman blog and the Press Play Podcast Network, I'm JD Hyman. As a Black man living here in America, I am living proof that while all men were created equal, not all men are equal. We're here to dig into the American political system, explore and unearth experiences from the human condition, and be a catalyst for some hard conversations that need to be had. Conversations that demand to be had. No matter what brought you here, I'm glad you came. Once again, my name is JD, and this is the Hyman Podcast. Part 1. 12 Years in Ohio. In season 1 of this podcast, I told you about the beginnings of my time in Ohio. The episode is titled, I'm Not Your Token Black Guy, if you haven't already listened to it. I told you about the question askers who pretended to be truth seekers. I told you about Bruce and all his friends. I told you about a VP of the university who tried to steal my humanity because apparently he didn't have any. I told you about the angry black man and how he all but saved my life and also set me in a path of self-destruction. And I told you about Shipe, who inadvertently saved me from myself. Well, that was just the beginning. Ohio has a special place in my heart. For 12 years, it was home, and I didn't realize that until I wasn't there anymore. There's something to be said about not missing home until you've been someplace different for a really long time. In fact, while I lived there, I kept my South Carolina's driver's license because I didn't want to give up my citizenship. And then a year before I came back to South Carolina, I relinquished my driver's license and became a full-fledged Ohioan. I had always told people I moved here for school and just never left, but that isn't entirely true. I was becoming part of the ecosystem. There were parts of this ecosystem that rejected me outright, and there were parts that fully embraced me, but more than that, it came with a cost. In the season 1 finale, I talked about the habit of belittling myself in an effort to come off disarming because I was under the impression that when people meet me, they assume I'm some sort of angry black man. Yeah, I know. I was projecting my insecurities outward, and in the process, it softened my resolve. What I mean by that is I had allowed people to say certain things or do certain things that other black people might get up in arms about. Was I scared? I don't know. But I did it so much that it basically became second nature. And what does doing this for years do to a person? Like I said, it softened my resolve. I became this person who I knew I wasn't, and I lived with that person for so long that I believe that's who I was. I remember one day I was at church, of all places, and one of the kids in the youth group made a racist joke, and there was this huge uproar in my defense. Actually, I'm lying. There was no defense. There was no uproar. In fact, a couple of the other kids laughed along with it. And the guy who was in charge of the youth said nothing, looked me square in the eye and said nothing. So I wasn't safe at church. Check. In October 2010, I was looking for a job, and through a series of cold calls, I was put in touch with a woman named Kate Mogan. This isn't one of those I changed the names to protect the innocent kind of deal. That was her real name. Kate worked for Circleville City School District. I don't exactly remember her position at the time, but I did know she was in charge of the after-school programming. I met Kate in her office and she said, "We're looking for a music teacher for our middle school after-school program, the Extra Mile program." It was funded by a 21st century grant from the federal government. It was designed to help students get help with homework, make up assignments, and a place where they could get after-school enrichment. But going back to Kate, she was looking for a music teacher, and I was like, well, I play the piano, but don't ask me to sing. And I was at the point in life where, while I needed money, I knew when to say no to a job that wasn't a good fit, and this was not a good fit. And then she clarified a little more. "Well, we have a music program, we just need someone to administer it," she said. I was really hesitant, but was I really capable of this? Remember earlier I told you about the crossroads? Well, as it turns out, this was one of them. This was a crossroad. Taking or not taking this job would change the trajectory of my life. And I chose to take the job. Looking back on it, that moment really did change my life, because meeting Kate Mogan led me to meeting Jonathan Davis and Karen Valentine and Ben Buckwalter. And then I graduated college and I had more time on my hands. And through the connections I made with Kate and Jonathan Karen, I was able to become a substitute teacher. I was 23 years old, the youngest person on the staff. I became friends with so many teachers, administrators, and staff in such a short time. And while I was at this predominantly white school, no one looked at me funny. No one said anything about the big black guy running relay races with 7th graders. I was the go-to substitute teacher. Whereas in most situations, you have to hope and pray for a subbing assignment, not me. The teachers planned around my schedule. They all saw me as a smart, reliable person who they knew they could entrust their students with. And for the most part, it wasn't just, hey, just stick this movie in or just have them do this worksheet. Most of the time, they gave me their lesson plan and they told me what they wanted to cover. And they did this because they didn't want their kids to have to miss a lesson, and the teacher didn't have to get off track with their plans. It was perfect. I was a de facto member of the 7th grade team, and they welcomed me into the fold as one of their own. It was during this time that I wrote a book, and the kids fell in love with it, so much so that it turned into a trilogy. I ran into Kate often during those years, and she looked out for me like a mother would a son. She found opportunities for me to move up in the district. She helped me get a summer job in IT that turned into a full-time job. But through all the things I did with the district, my heart was always with my little chaps, my extra mile kids. And while Kate saw other opportunities for me, she helped me to find other people so that I was able to do all the things I wanted to do, including extra mile. I usually go back to Ohio at least once per year, and I usually make it a point to go and see Kate because, you see, she gave me one of the greatest opportunities I was ever given. She gave me the chance to influence and impact the sons and daughters of people who otherwise would not have been able to. A chance to enrich their education, promote their self-growth, and give them a reason to want to exceed. And while it was never about saving them, it was about planting seeds. And while I wasn't around to see it, many of those seeds did sprout, and some of them grew into things few people thought possible. My motto then and still is, be it so that I improve the lives of the people around me by at least 50% over that of my own. And that is just what I did. One distinct memory I had was subbing for a 5th grade class. There was a student in the class. He was the only black kid in the class, maybe one of 2 in the whole school. I entered the classroom and introduced myself as Mr. Hyman, and the little boy nearly interrupted me. I spun around to see him standing up beside his desk. He asked, "Are you the teacher?" "Yes," I responded. Wow, he started. I've never had a black teacher before, he said, slowly returning to his seat. I was taken aback. It was in that moment that I realized the veracity of the job I was doing. I was shaping young minds, and for the first time, I saw myself through the eyes of a student. He was sitting in a classroom full of white kids, and the person standing at the front of the room commanding the class was a person who looked like him. I was speechless, but only for a moment, because I had a class to teach, and I had a little black kid watching my every move. And now I realize the importance of that. And before I knew it, 5 years had passed. I held a bachelor's degree in business management, and I was working on a master's degree in business administration. I knew there was nowhere for me to apply that degree in my current situation, and I wasn't going to go back to school to get a teaching degree, which I had considered somewhere along the road. I had come to another crossroad. I was in a place where for 5 years, not one person ever said anything derogatory or denigrative about me or my race, and I knew I couldn't stay. And at the same time, I didn't know how to leave. But through a series of what some would call unfortunate events, that decision was made for me. I was forced to face the situation head on. I was forced to find my way because I wasn't going to willingly. One day you're a saint, the next a pariah. And while I can't say I didn't play a role in how things wound up, the part I played was nothing compared to what I was facing. I remember getting phone calls from a lot of different people. Some people were genuinely concerned, others just wanted to know the tea, and I remember not being able to face the truth of what was happening. It was all so sudden, and at the same time it wasn't. There was some walking around on eggshells, trying not to make a splash, and it seemed like the more I tried to stay below the radar, the more I was forced onto it. No, I don't know the full story, and quite frankly, I don't need to know. What I do know is that if that had never happened, if I had never left, I can't imagine where I'd be today. I found myself searching my entire being for my purpose, for the next great thing. And it wasn't long after that I found myself working for the Ohio Department of Taxation. I would work there for 4 years in several capacities, but before my time there was up, I found myself once again fighting for my good name, and for no other reason than the color of my skin. More on that after the break.
What's up, everybody? Chase Smith here from the Chase Smith Podcast and Cavs on the Break NBA Podcast.
And I'm JD, host of the Hyman Podcast, part of the Press Play Podcast Network, and we are super excited to bring you a brand new show starting next Tuesday, the Fanfare Podcast.
The Fanfare Podcast is all about your favorite movies and our favorite movies and the best moments in cinema. To help guide our discussion, each episode will feature one classic, and we will grade this movie using a report card-like scale A through F. We're going to be grading categories like acting, directing, cinematography, the score, and even the movie poster itself.
And when we're not featuring a movie report card, we'll be sharing our movie rankings, franchise deep dives, actor and director interviews, and everything in between. Movies have been a major part of our lives, and we cannot wait to share our thoughts with you.
Our premiere episode will drop Tuesday, June 27th, and JD and I will be reviewing Raiders of the Lost Ark in preparation of the release of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny on June 30th, the 5th installment of the franchise.
Join us on the Fanfare Podcast, available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. Here's how Books with Brooks works. We read one book a month, and then we talk about it. Classics like Stephen King's The Shining, debut novels like We Are the Brennans by Tracy Lang, and tons of other compelling, life-changing stories, one book and 1 month at a time. So come read along with us, and then listen in.
Welcome everyone to Podcast 616, the official podcast of Earth 616. I am your host, Damon Royster, and I am inviting you to listen and subscribe to this Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast. On Podcast 616, we gather some of today's greatest comedians, writers, and actors to dive deep into all things Marvel, like comic book history and lore, all the interconnected superhero storylines, and of course, who's hot and who's not in the MCU. Honestly, why aren't you listening right now? You have the power to listen to Podcast 616. And as we always say, with great power comes even greater responsibility. Listen and subscribe to Podcast 616 wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, this is Don Mike Mendoza, the host of Producing While Asian. Join us in Season 2 for more conversations with actors, artists, producers, and more from Broadway, Hollywood, and beyond, every other Wednesday on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Part 2. I carry with me all of my things. While I was a tax auditor, I was working under a woman named Cheryl. Names are not being changed to protect the innocent, but I'll leave out her last name because I'm nice like that. Cheryl became a manager in the audit department about a month or so before I came up to the audit division, so she began to lay out the groundwork for the IFTA and IRP division. IFTA, IRP. International Fuel Tax Agreement and International Registration Plan. Now, this part is totally irrelevant, but it's an interesting concept, so I'm going to explain it for you. Large 18-wheeler trucks, known as motor carriers with a gross weight exceeding 26,000 miles, cause a lot of wear and tear to the roads, as opposed to smaller vehicles. Because of this, the 48 contiguous states, as well as certain Canadian provinces and territories, came up with an agreement to recoup the cost of repairing the roadways and evenly distributing fuel tax. The vehicles consume a lot of fuel. For example, say a motor carrier fuels up in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and then travels 17 miles north and crosses the North Carolina border. Now the vehicle drives through North Carolina and into Virginia. The tax on that fuel is apportioned between South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia based on the number of miles driven in each state. With regard to the IRP, this is the registration fee that motor carriers pay to operate. This fee is also apportioned to the states where the motor carrier operates based on the number of miles driven in each state. As an IFTA IRP auditor, my job is to collect the driving logs from the motor carriers, map the miles based on the logs, and ensure they pay sufficient fees and ensure the fees were apportioned to the appropriate states. Now, while the fees are apportioned based on the miles driven in a state, the fuel tax is apportioned based on the number of gallons consumed in each state. I know, it seems complicated, but it was a good time. 4 of us were promoted into this division, and they already had a group of working auditors. As the new manager, Cheryl was determined to make a name for herself, whether through personal ambition or the fact that the department was made up of mostly men. She wasted no time in disturbing the peace. Cheryl would often call me in her office, and at first it seemed like she was trying to mentor me, but then she started making awkward requests and saying things that I didn't think were very becoming of a manager. For one, she was already targeting an auditor who had been there since Christ was a child, but she started asking me about other coworkers, but it seemed for some reason that the people she was asking me about were the Black employees. She instructed me to spy on my coworkers and report back to her any wrongdoing. Obviously, I didn't do that, but I kept up appearances because she clearly couldn't be trusted. Several months went by and she hadn't asked me to commit any acts of espionage, and then a new group of auditors started. And unlike the previous groups of auditors, this group happened to be around my age. We became fast friends and Cheryl noticed. Cheryl came to resent these auditors and the relationship that I was beginning to form with them. Then one day out of the blue, she called me into her office and told me that my work product was starting to suffer. I was confused because just the other day, she was talking about how she wanted me to train the other auditors. At first, I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. She said she was going to be watching my work more closely, and we'd be following up in another couple of weeks. She used a familiar phrase telling me that I was on her radar. I was shook because there had been so many previous times where she brought me to her office, shut the door, and proceeded to tell me about other employees who were, and I quote, on her radar, like Hannon, who she didn't like because of her makeup and clothes, or Verna, who she just didn't like. or Toby, who she insisted was having an affair with another manager, or Della, who didn't conform to her ways right away, or Kira, who she said was too, and I quote, loud, or Eric, who I thought was a really good auditor, but he was on her radar for no other reason than he had the audacity to disagree with her. Cheryl's discrimination knew no bounds, but her discrimination against the Black employees had absolutely nothing to do with their work, because their work met or exceeded the standards placed before us. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, I made sure the work I submitted was nothing less than perfect. And after that 2-week period, we met again, this time with one of the division administrators. She had this grim look on her face. The administrator sat there on his phone, seemingly unbothered by the entire situation. She gave me a piece of paper and told me that it was a written warning. Now, you have to remember, I was working for the state of Ohio, and when it comes to the state of Ohio, we called them Congress jobs because it would literally take an act of Congress to get fired once you were through the initial probationary period. After she handed me the paper, she said I needed to sign it. She also said I could include a statement with it before signing it. I thought about it and told her I wanted to include a statement. She had this look on her face, almost like a kid whose ice cream cone fell on the floor, was snatched up by a rabid animal, and had run off. Well, it's already dated, she said. I'll make sure to get it back to you tomorrow, I told her. So I went back to my desk and opened up my email. I searched through and found various pieces of information that I needed. I wasn't going to take this lying on my back. So I got to writing and writing and writing. And just when I thought I was done, I wrote some more. It was in the form of an affidavit. It was a comprehensive retelling of all the events that led up to this moment. A detailed narrative of everything she'd ever told me in confidence. The things she said about my coworkers, the things she said about her bosses, the spying she asked me to do, all of it. I included 5 pages in appendices of supporting documentation in the form of notes, emails, and other correspondences. It was some of my finest work. I printed it out, attached it to the write-up, and went home. I wouldn't be able to turn it in until the next day. I read it to myself. I must have read it to myself at least a half dozen times. And the more I read it, the more I began to not recognize myself. In fact, I was starting to see someone who I hadn't seen in quite some years. The angry Black man. He was all over that statement. He had come to my defense in one of the most glorious ways anyone ever had, and it frightened me. Had I come all this way just to fall back onto old ways, letting anger and hatred guide me, or was I going to come back to rationality, reason, and logic? I asked myself, JD, what is the virtue in turning in this document? What will become of it? Will they fire her? Not likely. Will she see the error of her ways and change? Also not likely. To wit, the wrong thing done for the right reason is still the wrong thing. Why did I wait until now? Until I was the target, when I watched her torment people and stood idly by. Was I any better? Would this put me on her level? Is that a place I wanted to be? Down in the dirt, in the mud, with her? I fell asleep that night with all of this on my mind. I was being tormented by a decision I had yet to make, ghosts that had yet to be birthed. The next day, I walked into work, and instead of going straight to the 6x6 cell of a cubicle I had been relegated to, I took a detour to human resources. I spoke to a woman there for a bit, signed a few pieces of paper, stopped by that administrator for a brief conversation, and then I went to see Cheryl. I handed her the write-up, signed my own scathing statement, and in its place, another document. What's this? She asked. I'm taking a 3-month sabbatical, and when I get back, you're not going to be my boss anymore. And that's what I did. I took a 3-month paid sabbatical. I handed her the papers, packed up a few things, and left the building. It was time for me to leave behind the monotony of a profession that had very little prospect for the type of future I wanted for myself. It was time to reevaluate some things, and that's what I did. For 3 months, I was that person who went to the gym in the middle of the day. I was the person who did the grocery shopping in the morning. I wound up buying more clothes because I realized most of my closet was work clothes. I made a few trips to South Carolina, got good usage out of the Cedar Point season pass, visited my old stomping grounds and old friends, and I reconnected with the ideals that I knew were part of my person, ideals that meant something to me. I didn't want to be defined by my job or that place I worked. I didn't want to be a person who felt like they always had to fight back. I didn't want to be a person who stood idly by. I knew who I was. I knew what I stood for. Those things were imprinted on me a long time ago, and somewhere along the road, I simply forgot. And it wasn't until I realized that I already knew these things that I became enlightened to the fact that all the parts of me that make me the human being that I am already reside in me. My faith, my intelligence, my purity of spirit, my insane optimism, my humor and wit, my spontaneity, my inner joy, my positivity, my protectiveness of the people and things that matter most to me, my unmistakable laugh, my indestructible grasp of reality, and my undeniable sense of home. These are the things that make me who I am. They are always with me, some on the inside, others on the out, but always there, always present and accessible when I need them. So I got a tattoo. One to remind me that A, I am a man of principle and purpose, and B, those are the things that define me. Omnia mea mecum porto. I carry with me all of my things. My name is JD Hyman. This is the Hyman Podcast. I'll see you next time. The Hyman Podcast was written, edited, and produced by myself. Share with guests Whitney Hall and Mary Louise Layton co-produce and research. Cover art and branding by Kevin Aki. The theme music was composed and produced by Jim Yosef with additional music license from Epidemic Sound. The Hyman Podcast is a production of the Press Play Podcast Network. Press Play is staffed by Chase Smith, our CEO and fearless leader. I serve as Chief Operating Officer, and Brooks May is the Chief Creative Officer. To learn more about the network, sponsorships, guest appearances, or if you're interested in launching your own podcast on our network, visit us on the web at www.pressplaypodcast.com. To learn more about this podcast, our mission and vision, or for sponsorship information, please visit us on the web at www.jdhyman.com.